Jason Fernandes, COO and co-founder of AE Token, joins us on the line to take a closer look at ICO scams. Jason, thank you so much for joining us on the line.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Now, we have a kind of plenty to discuss today, but first of all, we're going to take a look at ICO exit scammers. This is something which has been really prevalent since around 2017 and the early stages of ICOs being introduced into the market. Something that's fascinating about this is, will scams always be a part of the crypto ecosystem, in your opinion, or will they eventually go away as regulation gets introduced and as markets mature a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think they will continue to exist to some extent, but I think the negative effect will be greatly limited vis-a-vis the global crypto market as soon as new regulation starts to come and become a reality. Particularly like countries like Malta and Estonia are really leading the way over here. And I think ultimately it'll be easier to tell what are scams and what are legitimate projects. And there's also a lot of companies and projects that are working on this problem anyway. There's coin governance system in out of Spain, and which I'm an expert for. Essentially, the idea is to try to figure out which scam projects and to try to avoid people getting scammed by putting their money there.
And I think what you've said there is the million-dollar question is, how do investors know whether they're sitting on a future gold mine or whether it is a potential scam? As someone that has raised a really popular ICO that's won several awards among conferences across the world, especially 2018 has been a great year for AE Token. How would you determine, as someone that is in the ICO business, how would you advise investors on what is a scam and what to look out for?
I think the first thing to look at is whether what they're proposing is actually possible. And because especially with a lot of projects, some of the stuff that they're proposing isn't even technologically possible. So that's like your first question to figure out whether something is particularly feasible in the first place. The second thing to look at would be the team. So you'll find a lot of these ICOs. So I review a lot of ICOs on ICO Bench, and you'll find that they've got a list of team members. And then when you go to their team members' LinkedIn pages, it doesn't correlate. So they don't say that they're working for those same projects. And it has been an issue in the past that people have listed projects that they're supposedly rather team members that are supposedly members of the project, but have no idea that they've been listed on the website. So those are probably the two main things to look at. But also, I would say to see how transparent the ICO is in terms of how much money they've raised so far and how much money they're raising in the future. So generally, the more transparent an ICO is, the more likelihood that it's going to not be a scam.
Fantastic. And as you mentioned there, so you are an advisor for ICO Bench. So what kind of things do you see as well when it comes to, you mentioned crowdfunding, how much people are looking to raise? Is there a specific figure that maybe you say, well, that's a little bit too much or that's a little bit less? Is there some kind of gray area which is kind of outside of the green area?
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on what their goal is, like what they're trying to achieve. So obviously, the more complicated their goal, the more money they would need to achieve to raise that. Another thing that's really important is whether they have a hard cap or not. And a lot of scam ICOs don't really have a hard cap, or their hard cap is so high. So if you have a really large difference between the soft cap and the hard cap, and there's not a lot of explanation about what are the steps in between, like what they can achieve with various different tranches of money, then you have to wonder how exactly they came up with those numbers. And generally, most ICOs are raising anywhere from 3 to 25 to $30 million, but companies that are raising much more, or particularly companies that don't have a hard cap, those that I would be particularly cautious with.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your insights so far. We'll join with you for a second time throughout today's show. Thank you.
This is Blocks Live TV.
AE Token COO and co-founder Jason Fernandes joins us on the line once again. Now, Jason, we're talking about ICOs here, and in particular in the Asia region, we've seen some ICO scams coming out over the past few weeks. And one in particular that caught our attention was the one that we shared the story with, which was actually a crowdfunder that actually came back into the market, which is particularly interesting. What we're going to look at now is from the point of view of the people that are actually running an ICO. This is a really open market. This is something which is quite difficult for ICOs to prove that they are established, especially if they're in regions, as you mentioned earlier in the show, outside of places like Malta and Estonia. If they are operating from other regions, how do they prove that they are legitimate? There are also certain things that have come out, such as, Bollywood actresses and singers attending ICO launches that then turned out to be a scam. Is really flamboyant launch parties, is that a red flag? Are there certain things, in your opinion, that maybe ICOs shouldn't do in their initial launch months, and that might give the impression that maybe they're not as legitimate as they could seem? What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I think when you have massive social media campaigns, these things like Initiative Q, where basically it's the same message being forwarded by like millions of people, you really have to start wondering whether they have something substantial behind it, or whether it's all hype. So a lot of companies that have massive hype issues, you really have to like take another look at, and also companies that have used really famous musicians or actors to promote their product. Or let's say Floyd Mayweather recently promoted a product. Like these are not really their areas of expertise. Like a boxer doesn't really know very much about ICOs. So when you have people that are like actors promoting it, or boxers and things that it's not really their expertise, you really have to think twice about whether this is particularly the ICO for you.
If we are looking at it from the point of view of an ICO, as someone that does work for ICO Bench as well as an advisor and reviewer, is there any aspects of the white paper, for example, certain pages? Sometimes you see a white paper and it has maybe 120 pages, which is absolutely large. It's a phenomenal amount of information and facts there. At the same time, if you compare it to Satoshi's white paper, which was significantly smaller, is there a kind of a happy medium? Is there a kind of a right or a wrong answer when it comes to the size of an ICO white paper?
Yeah, again, there's no absolute right or wrong answer. It really depends on what the ICO is trying to achieve. But yes, it is a clue when you have like a light paper, or rather a white paper that has almost very little information in it. So those are times you have to think twice. A lot of companies will put out two white papers. They'll put out a technical white paper, and they'll put out like a business centric white paper. Generally, the ones with technical white papers would probably be more trustworthy, because you can actually go in and look at what technology they're actually proposing. So yeah, the more information that the company is willing to provide, generally the better. And when you have companies that have like white papers like really short, like 12 pages and under, you really have to start wondering whether they're legitimate, and whether they can actually do what they're saying they can do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your insights once again, and we'll join with you for a final time to take a look at ICOs in the future. Thank you, Jason.
This is Blocks Live TV.
The COO and co-founder of AE Token, Jason Fernandes, joins us on the line now. Jason, we're touching on ICO. So throughout the show, we've touched on, if you're an investor, what kind of things you should look out for, what could potentially be a red flag. We've also touched on it, if you are building an ICO and you are creating that, what things you should be wary that you're not putting the wrong message out there. On a final note, we're going to touch on this story that we've read out here, which is a little bit more specific. So we're looking at Purebit, which was a South Korean startup launching a private ICO, which raised more than 13,000 Ether. It then kind of disappeared. We saw on the social media chats there were some messages such as "thank you" and "I'm sorry," and then it came out on social media, public news for South Korea, that actually the money had been refunded to a lot of people in the space. I think the big question here when we look at this story is looking at it as an example for future investors and for future traders. Could it be that this project just grew a little bit too big and maybe got out of control? So maybe it wasn't a scam initially, it just snowballed and it got a little bit more attention than it was needed. What was your take on this when you read the story initially?
Yeah, I think Purebit is a project. I'm not really sure what exactly the background behind that is, particularly because they actually, as you mentioned, they have returned some amounts of money, but it's still a gray area, because only some customers have received money, and they've received less than 50% of how much they put in. And also, a lot of the Purebit is actually asking for the private keys for these people's wallets in order to like give them more money. So I would really wonder whether that's actually a prudent thing for these people to do, because they could be scammed further. And so I'm not really sure why exactly Purebit went ahead and returned some of the money if they were a complete scam. But even if you consider the fact that they were to take 50%, that still makes them a scam. and there's really no excuse for that. I mean, I think that the companies, the ICO companies that are scams, know that they're scams from the get go, and it's not something that just develops. If it were something that would have just developed, they could always refund the money. There's nothing stopping them from refunding the money to the people that have put in their money. And if really they're not able to achieve what they should, what they promised, then that's pretty much their goal. They need to return the money.
And you're absolutely right. And I think a really interesting point is you have to ask the people, especially the pioneers, the co-founders of organizations, the people that have built the ICO themselves. And that's why these expos are so great, such as Multi-Blockchain Summit, all these events where you can actually go and meet people on the ground and speak to them about their projects, is you can tell pretty much straight away if one of the co-founders or organizers understands the technology behind what they're endorsing, or whether or not they just think it is a great idea that they're looking to push. And that also gives quite a good indication as well. So you mentioned the team then. Just for a final note, do you think also these kind of these meetups like we are seeing, where you can go and you can speak to people on the ground, do you think as a larger scale investor that should be one of the fundamental things, that if you are looking to put in money, you should at least meet the people and understand a little bit more about what you're investing in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these face-to-face meetings, there's really no substitute for. So certainly, like as many conferences that an ICO can legitimately attend and communicate with investors on a one-to-one basis, the investors then know that they're at least like a real company, and they physically exist in the same space. Another thing that could be useful to look at is whether or not they have a prototype or at least a mock-up of what they're trying to put together, because that sort of gives you an idea that these people are serious. And also, like you were saying, events like Multi-Blockchain Summit, various conferences, when you can actually meet the people in person, then it gives you a little bit more genuineness, so you can figure out whether they're genuine or not.
Fantastic. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us on the line today. It was an absolute pleasure to hear your insights.